The government is considering sending more British troops to Afghanistan. Their role would be training rather than combat duties. BBC understands that the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has written to the Prime Minister recommending that the UK should increase its military presence in the country, which makes this a good moment to look at what's been happening there since combat troops left. Kate Clark is co-director of the Afghanistan Analyst Network. She told me how much of the country is now under Taliban rather than government control.
The picture's not very good at all. There was a BBC survey at the end of last year which showed that only 30% of the country's districts are under full government control. Now, the Taliban only control 4% of the districts, but all the rest are under some form of Taliban threat. That might be an attack every week, or it might be an attack every 3 months, but there's some sort of Taliban presence in more than 2/3 of the country. Things got worse after the international forces largely withdrew in 2014. The Taliban took a lot of territory, particularly in the rural areas. The government has managed to hold on to all the provincial centres, but it lost district centres. And the conflict is nasty. Last year there were 10,000 Afghan civilians killed and injured.
And in just the last few weeks there's been a real spike in violence, hasn't there?
Yeah, there's usually a spike in violence in the spring, but this year's been very nasty. I'm sure listeners have heard about the big bombings in Kabul. That's not only from the Taliban, but also from the Islamic State group. The Taliban still have some red lines. Islamic State group appears to have none. So it is quite happy to target civilians without even the fig leaf of a government or a military target. And it also is happy and wants to kill Afghan Shia Muslims. So it's introduced a sectarian element that really wasn't present in the Afghan war before now.
And just picking up on Islamic State, how well established are they now?
They're marginal in terms of the territory they hold. And what little they did hold, they've lost most of it in the last year or two. However, what they have done is they've found themselves a role as purveyors of particularly nasty, indiscriminate urban terrorist attacks.
You paint a picture of a country in which the government doesn't control all its territory and the security forces can't ensure security.
Yeah, that's right. I think one of the problems is that pre-2014, so that's when President Karzai was in control and there were international forces on the ground fighting, the government didn't really need to fight the insurgency. It had international forces. And the state developed in very weak and corrupt ways, particularly the Ministry of Interior, which controls the police force, and the police in Afghanistan are paramilitaries, but also the army. The army was less bad, but still bad. So that meant that when you had the government forces taking responsibility for the security of the country, and a new president, President Ghani, they inherited a state that really wasn't fit for purpose. The police in particular are very corrupt. They're involved in crime. This is one of the things that the international forces are trying to deal with at the moment.
Well, given the scale of those challenges, will a few hundred extra British troops really make much difference?
Well, in one sense, no. Afghans have to deal with this themselves. But the international support is absolutely crucial for keeping the government in place. And if the funding went, then the state forces would collapse. You would likely have a civil war, and the prospects of chaotic, violent civil war in Afghanistan are not a pleasant prospect.
That was Kate Clark. The new British troops would go to the so-called Sandhurst in the Sand, just outside Kabul. Martha Carney was there in the run-up to the withdrawal of British combat troops in 2014.
It's a military song known as Tirana, being sung by Afghan officer recruits. They're being inspected on the parade ground by General Sir Nick Carter, the head of the British Army.
What a song. No, it's a jewel in the Afghan Army's crown, this now.
Now, the head of the college, the commandant, is Brigadier General Mohammed Sharifi.
I think ISAF, NATO supported too much Afghan National Army. Now we are in this situation to defend our country ourselves. It is our best hope and best wish in Afghanistan.
As well as training up hundreds of male officers, there's an ambition to encourage women to go into the army, as I discovered in the shade of a large shed away from the gaze of the parade ground. Why did you decide to come here?
I like help to Afghan people because I am a server to Afghan people, and I like Afghan people.
Is the physical work, is the PT, is it difficult?
No.
Really?
Yes.
As Martha reporting 4 years ago, General Sir Richard Barron's led campaigns in Afghanistan and says the uplift of troop numbers now under consideration is a suitable contribution.
Traditionally, we've been roughly 10% of the scale of the US effort. So by stepping up to 1,000, we're still well short of that. So we may have to consider doing a bit more. But the most important thing here is that this has to be part of a strategy that gets the parties to this conflict to come to a sort of reconciliation discussion.
Jawad Ludin was Deputy Foreign Minister of Afghanistan and President Hamid Karzai's Chief of Staff. Thank you for coming in. It is a pretty depressing picture, isn't it, after all this time, to hear that so much of the country is still under Taliban control and the violence is still so extreme.
I agree with you, and I think no one else feel it stronger than the Afghan people who are bearing the brunt of the situation and the violence. Having said that, it will not be the entire picture if we see Afghanistan in isolation. Let's just remember that the region that surrounds Afghanistan is primarily what sustains violence, not only in that country, but in the whole region. So we are, in a way, that country is, in a way, a product of its region. And that leads to one other measure, apart from sending troops, training the Afghan army, and making sure that the Afghans fight the fight and are able to defend the country and protect it from terrorists. It's very important also to focus at the geopolitics of the region as well.
Just staying with security for a moment, though, the arrival of IS as a real force is extremely disturbing, isn't it?
Well, you see, again, from here, sometimes for the sake of analysis in giving the wider public in the world a story, it's easy to say that the IS arrived in Afghanistan. Frankly, when we see it a little closer, it's nothing more than just a label. It's the same people,
but it's
the same
a label
recruits.
with really brutal tactics attached to it.
That's absolutely correct, and I think that's been an extremely worrying trend because, as your previous caller, Kate Clark, said, the Taliban probably did stop at something. But now this new trend is much more extreme, and it is worrying. But I think the important thing is, whether it's the IS or whether it's the Taliban or any other force, the main thing that has happened in the last 2-3 years, since 2014, is that the Afghans are now doing the fight. So other troops...
Well, sorry, just picking you up on that, I mean, let me put to you the question I put to Kate Clark, which is, given the scale of the challenges we've been talking about, how much difference will a few hundred extra British troops make?
Well, I would say quite a lot, because frankly, one reason that the Afghans are unable to do the fight on their own at the moment is also partly because over the last 16 years, we didn't seem to invest enough in building up the force in order to be capable to fight against the challenges that are there. A lot of people say the Afghan war has gone on for 16 years, but there is this famous saying that, in fact, the Afghan war is a one-year war fought 16 times. So there was, and I was in that government. I served in the Afghan government for 12 years, and during that time, one thing was I saw a bit of a reluctance in terms of seeing the situation in a more long-term sense, therefore investing the right amount of resources, training, capabilities at the right time, which would have enabled the Afghans to now do the war and fight the war independently. And that's what I think what we're doing now. And I think I'll add just a very quick point. Really, what is the other choice that the British people have, or other countries in the world have? That threat that we're fighting in Afghanistan is the same that would come and affect Europe if they could.
We must leave it there. Jawad Ludin, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Coming up,